All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the 2023 Athletics Canada webinar series. Got a good one for you today. My name is John LaFranco. I'm the manager of coaching education for Athletics Canada. And today we have with us the talented Dr. Joe Baker. So we'll unpack that in a bit, but just a couple things before we begin. So you're all muted. That's how it works. We're on the webinar version of Zoom here. If you have questions, please put them in the questions dialog box on your screen. Our colleague Kyle Smith is here as always to check out your questions and add them to our list. We'll have about 15 minutes, maybe a bit more, depending on how much Dr. Joe and I speak to answer your questions at the end. We're recording the webinar, and so it will be posted in the coming days on the Athletics Canada YouTube channel. And as always, coaches who have entered the NCCP number and are NCCP certified will receive 1 PD point for their participation here tonight. So this is the first in our winter series. The next one coming up is going to be Thursday, February 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern. And it's called The Myths and Mysteries of the 800 Meters. And guests will include the very in-demand Ron Thompson, coach of Marco Arop, Gareth Sanford, who's an exercise physiologist, who's done a lot of work on middle distance, and maybe some others. So we'll see. And after that, we're going to have something on pole vault and strength training. So we've got a couple interesting topics coming your way this year, this winter spring on the webinar series. So Dr. Joe Baker, he's a professor and head of the Lifespan Performance Laboratory at York University in Toronto, Canada. His research considers the varying influences on optimal human development, ranging from issues affecting athlete development, skill acquisition, to barriers and facilitators of optimal aging. He's worked with a range of teams and organizations around the world, including, I'm going to take a big breath here because there's lots of them: Own the Podium, the Canadian Paralympic Committee, Tennis Canada, Rugby Canada, the Canadian Sports Institute Ontario, the Texas Rangers, I assume the baseball team, USA Lacrosse, Australian Institute of Sport, UK Coaching, the Coaching Association of Canada, and many, many others. He's published 12 books, the latest of which is this one right here, The Tyranny of Talent. That's what we're going to talk about today. In addition, he's published over 300 scientific articles, book chapters, commentaries, basically, like I said, a talent. So if you want to check out his work, I just put it in the chat there. He's got a webpage at York and is on Twitter, as all the academics are these days. So all right, welcome, Dr. Joe. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well, John. How about you?
I'm well. I'm good. I'm excited to chat. This is gonna be good. I really enjoyed your book. It was funny. It came in the mail and I was like, oh, I was going to get this book. I don't remember that I ordered it though. And I'm like, oh, cool. And then I looked in and it was a present from somebody. So I was going to buy it and I didn't, but someone bought it for me. So it was perfect. So
that's great.
Yeah. So let's dive right into it. Like, I think, the first thing is, we love dichotomies. We love nature versus nurture, talent versus hard work. But the argument in your book is that this is too simplistic for youth sport development. And it kind of goes in other directions too, but let's talk about youth sport development. What are some of the more complex factors that interact to create and maybe do or do not predict athletic performance?
I think you sort of, it took me the 250 pages to summarize what you just summarized, which is the things that we task coaches to do in athlete development and selection identification is monstrously complicated, and it can't be split into nice, clean dichotomies like nature or nurture or talented or untalented or early specialization or diversification. These things that they deserve more appreciation for how complicated they are. And so that was kind of the purpose of the book. And, I think your question around what are some of the examples of this, they're everywhere around us. And I think good coaches become good coaches because of their ability to navigate those complexities. And so I think even in athletics, which, some people in maybe more dynamic team-based or decision-making sports would say, well, those are less complicated, but even those sports, when you look at an athlete and they're setting a time for a sprint or a middle distance run, we have to take that performance and frame it relative to a number of factors. How long have they been training? What environment have they been training in? How good has the coaching been, the feedback been? What opportunities have they had for development? So even these sports where it looks like a very clean sort of performance, the performance that we see on a day is complicated by all these other factors. Put that into a long-term pathway for development. Well, now we have questions around when are people going to peak at different skills, different capacities that we see. What's their, the simpler ones are growth, maturation, peak height velocity, those kinds of things that we understand quite well. But other things I think we understand much less, like the drive and persistence that an athlete is going to need in order to be a world champion or a national team member. We need to see passion. We need to see drive. We need to see commitment. Well, where does that come from? And how do we as coaches or as support staff, how do we promote those kinds of developmental outcomes? Those things for us are big black holes in terms of athlete development. We know we need them at the end of the pathway, but where they come from, how early they need to be there, or is it natural, or is there something we can do to ensure that they develop? These are really open questions.
Yeah, for sure. So we have no idea what we're doing, basically, is what you're saying.
Well, I don't know that that's true. I think there's some things that we have a pretty good handle on, but the problem is that everybody knows those things. And so if we want to get a competitive advantage, we have to look where other people aren't looking. And I think for us, that's the psychology, it's cognition, it's behavior. If we can predict behavior, who's going to stick around for 10 years or the overused 10,000 hours. If we can predict who that person is at the start of the journey, then that might be as good as we'll get at predicting talent.
Mm-hmm. So one of the dichotomies, and you mentioned it, is this sort of, early versus late specialization. And it's been sort of framed as like sports are categorized that way. So there's, on the one hand, there's a sort of like this demonization of early specialization, but on the other hand, it's sort of like, well, in some cases it does happen in others, but I'm going to guess it's not as simple as that. So can you tell us a bit about what you've written on that topic?
Sure. This is a pretty much, I think, an open conversation that we're having in the sports science world as well. That this idea of specialization, there was a period where we were, the scientific community and the policymakers were very anti-specialization. And so we wanted to promote diversification or multi-sport engagement in early development as early as we can and as much as we could. Mm-hmm. The problem with that, though, is if you come from a low socioeconomic status family and you can't afford to put your kid into multiple sports, then you're marginalized when we say, you can't specialize. Some people specialization is all they can afford. And so for us, the more interesting question is, how can we deliver specialization to athletes who want it in a safer way without any of the risks that might be associated with that pathway?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned a few things there. Another thing that, I think about, because I have kids, in sport. So I have an 8-year-old boy who plays hockey and he's a goalie. Yeah. So the things I think about are like, in order for him to get good enough to enjoy the thing that he's doing, he's got to do it like a fair bit. So he's got to, he's on the ice 3 times a week. And that's, I feel like kind of a lot for his age, but at the same time, if he's not, then you can kind of see he kind of loses the plot a bit. And like, in order for it to be enjoyable, he's got to be kind of focused. But then like, in order to put him in another sport like swimming or like, I don't know, judo or something, which I'd love to do, the schedule doesn't work because you've got these days that are blocked off. And the judo is like, judo is 2 times a week or 3 times a week too. And so the sports don't coordinate in order to make it easy. Never mind if you can afford it or have the time, but just even if you did, sometimes it just doesn't work. So, I mean, is there a way that we can facilitate that somehow, do you think, or?
I think there is. The thing that we're trying to focus on in our lab are more around the developmental needs of the athlete during that period of development. And we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that the way we train, late adolescent adult athletes is the way that we could train kids. There's specific learning needs that kids have that will affect the way that they think about sport and the behaviors they're going to have for the rest of their life. And if we understood what those developmental needs are, then we could figure out a way to deliver those, whether that's in a specialized environment or a multi-sport environment or whatever. And so having that sort of clarity in the system, I think, would be really important. I think we're seeing movement towards that. You know, the Sport for Life model, the LTAD, those kinds of things are kind of grounded in the idea that there's an approach that we should have early in development. And so I think the discussion is there. I think we maybe don't know enough about what those specific needs are and how they translate into long-term elite performance. We understand participation, I think, but whether that actually leads to the kind of dominance we want to see in our elite performers, I'm not sure that those are the same equation.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, this is a bit off script, but it just, you know, I've been thinking about this too. So my son's in hockey, and like, I'm very cognizant of, like, you know, having him not turn into like a jerk or whatever, which is sort of the, you know, the stereotype thing that happens. But I see why this happens, because especially when they're little kids, they're all geared up and they can't do certain things for themselves. So they're attended to. Like, he's a goalie, like, I'm strapping his pads at this point. Like, there's no way around it, you know? So, but like, you want to kind of create this independence, but at the same time, like, they're made to feel special. And so that's, you talk about this in your book about how situations and environments can have like a variety of impact on people that we don't really know. Like the Michael Jordan example, he got cut and it made him, like, you know, fight for it, and someone else might get cut and then they just walk away, and we just don't know. So like, what do you think about that? Like, the, you know, knowing that we don't know what our actions may bring, how do we approach, and maybe from like a you know, like a coach and even parent, you know, point of view, how do we approach youth sport, you know, with that in mind?
It's a tough one. And we have this conversation with coaches quite a bit because, you know, coaches want to know what the recipe to success is. And we don't know what that recipe is. We know, but we can tell them what the recipe for disaster is. And it's, if you undermine long-term motivation, if you undermine enjoyment, if you undermine, you know, the development of passion and those kinds of characteristics, then it doesn't matter what kind of environment you put the person in. When they get autonomy and they get to make their own decisions, they're not going to stick around. And so if our feedback to coaches is try to create an environment where no matter what, the person is able to thrive. And for a lot of performers in competitive environments, it's competency. They want to see improvement. They want to see times going down or distance going up or those kinds of things. But early in the pathway, people might not just be motivated by competence. They might be motivated by enjoyment. They might be motivated by social connection. They might be motivated by autonomy. And so, you know, one of the things that we really try to encourage in the book is moving away from a single model or a single approach that's going to fit all your athletes. We need to be more varied than that, because that's the variability that we're seeing in the pathways. Yeah,
that makes sense. So you mentioned LTAD a couple of times, and I felt like in the book you maybe called it out a little bit in terms of being, you know, maybe too sort of rigid or structured. I mean, it was and still is, I think, fairly lauded as a good approach. But maybe do you think there are ways that we should change how we use that tool of the LTAD?
Yeah, it's funny. The LTAD I kind of picked on a little bit in the book because it's the model that I know well, because I come from Canada. When I'm in Australia, I criticize their model. And so it's not I'm not picking on LTAD as much as I'm picking on models themselves. And that's not to say that there's no value in having a framework. I think there is. It's just that with coaches, they have a tendency to fall back on the model. What does a model tell me? And they tend to look at those things more rigidly than they should be with athlete development. So we should be looking for athletes that don't fit that model and why, and maybe what they bring to the situation. So I'm not really against models as much as I'm against the rigid use of those kinds of models. And so I think there's, you know, having a model and a framework that we can use to advise coaches and policymakers for resourcing and for, you know, when certain things need to happen. I think that's a great strategy, but don't assume every athlete is going to follow that model.
Yeah, I mean, you hear that a lot sometimes with, talking to coaches, like, oh, that doesn't fit the LTAD, or like the LTAD says this. It's like, but what does that athlete need right now? Like that's, and it can be good the other way too. It can be say, well, I don't care about the LTAD. Like, this 12-year-old kid, I'm going to pound them with intervals because they're going to get good.
Exactly.
Like, so it's just, yeah, you're right. The model is there. It's like a tool that you can use or not. And yeah. So in athletics, I think, and you mentioned this a bit off the top too, like we can be a bit smug about our development process in a way because we don't have really subjective factors that a team sport might need or something. We can say, okay, you did the high jump, you jumped this high, so therefore that means that you're on this path. And so why is this method not working as well as we might think it is?
There's really two things there, I think. One is the idea that the performance that we get isn't affected by subjective factors. I think there are. How the person gets to that point is driven by human behavior, just like everything is. And so how much training do they put in and why? And are they putting in 100% effort? Are we getting every hour out of practice for them? Those are subjective variables. The other thing is, depending on where that person is in their pathway, the performance and how they view that performance is going to affect the motivation moving forward. And so, like, these things are subjective. If anything, maybe we could say that they're less complicated by external factors than other sports. If you're distance running, distance jumped, all those kinds of things, there's no teammates that are affecting your performance. And so there's simpler performance tasks in that sense. I would say the other part, which is what I think you were getting at, is the value of these kind of benchmarks for looking at performance progression across the pathway, which is a really valuable tool for looking at whether people are meeting the trajectory that we expect them to be on. I think the danger, though, is to assume that if somebody isn't meeting the trajectory, that they're never going to be able to rebound and make that distance back up. So for us, we advise people to use those benchmarks, but we advise them as not so much in selection decisions, but in feedback to the athlete about where they could be improving. We're not seeing you progressing the way that we've seen athletes in the past. And it's maybe because of these factors. And so it's almost like a way of tailoring training strategies to them based on gaps and weaknesses that you're seeing in their performance. We think that's a better approach for selection because it takes the power of selection away from the system and that sort of rigid approach. If you didn't meet the benchmarks, then you're out. And it gives the power back to the athlete. If the athlete doesn't see that progression and they don't see, improvement over time, they're probably going to leave anyway because they're seeing that motivation for competence being undermined. If they don't and they want to keep trying, the Michael Jordan example, which is what you mentioned, if they double down and start training harder, smarter, sacrificing more, then the potential is they could come back into the system later. And so we want to leave as many doors open as possible for them to re-engage.
Well, and so you allude to something there that I think is in the background here that I want to sort of foreground, is that in the system and selection, it's sort of there's limited resources. So, I mean, if we're taking out, if we're not giving jumper B a chance, but jumper A is there, but if we change the system, are we not just swapping one out for the other because we can only afford to support one anyway? So, I mean, obviously it matters greatly to jumper A and B, but in terms of a bigger picture of, whatever and this is an assumption that we're making, that the goal is to have like good athletes at the top. So does, how do we, I guess the question is, how do we manage something like this in a limited resource environment?
It's a great question. And I think we need to get comfortable with the reality of high performance sport and resource limitations, which is when we limit spots and opportunities for athlete development, we're always going to be missing talent because our systems, the sophistication we have for understanding what talent is and what it looks like and how it evolves over time, we're not there yet in terms of our understanding to be able to create a net that's going to capture everybody. And so we need to get comfortable with the fact that we're going to miss people in our talent development systems. We're going to make decisions that don't end up paying out. And so for us, the flip side is, how do we make those decisions less impactful on the athlete's long-term journey? So can we give them that feedback? You're not making the team this year, and have it make very little impact on their training from one day to the next, so that they don't see it as as a decision maker in terms of their long-term career prospects, that they're just, okay, yeah, I understand. I don't agree, but I understand. And so I'm going to train harder next time so I can make it.
So another potential solution to this that you brought up is, and I forget exactly, it's the rugby union in the UK, I guess. You can maybe explain the situation, but it seems like they sort of dropped a lot of their sort of earlier selection. And so they've essentially, that line of like when you're selected in and not has been pushed up. And so that there's sort of less selection at lower ages. Can you explain what they've done and how that, can potentially transfer, or what are some of the benefits of a system like that?
Sure. So the example that I talk about in the book was a think tank that I was part of in, I think it was 2013, where they brought in the top athlete development researchers from around the world because they were struggling with a phenomenon called the relative age effect, where kids that were making it to the highest levels of rugby were more likely to be born right after a cutoff date for organizing the age group, which means that they're older than the people they're being compared with. And this happens early in the pathway. And when you select kids early in the pathway, these selections end up having long-term consequences for their development. And so the selection occurs early, but the consequences are seen later at the national team. Rugby union had some of the worst relative age effects we'd ever seen. And so this was a big problem for us, or for them. And so they brought us in. We said, one of the ways that you could mitigate this is by not emphasizing the power of selection on your long-term athlete development pathway. So they decided after the end of that 2-day think tank in London that they were going to not do any national team selections until the age of 15. That was as early as they could go. We recommended going later because sometimes, puberty and a lot of growth and development is happening then. But they said, well, 15 is about as, it's not as good as we'd like, but it's as good as we can do in our system. And they've had a pretty good success since doing that. And it doesn't mean that there's no competition and that, it's just a free for all until 15. They still have rankings and identification at the local and the regional level. It just wasn't happening at the national level. And so we've seen improvements in their relative age effects as a result of this. They've had better international success from doing this. It's one of these things that we wish that we could have studied them long term to be able to say, well, it's because of this, that, and the other thing, but we can't. All we see is improvement in the system.
So what age were they selecting people before?
Good question. Yeah, I'm not an expert on rugby union, but because of the power of that sport in their country, I'm assuming it would be like ice hockey in Canada, right? It would be early streaming, 7, 8, 9.
Okay, so like the way that, you were explaining, I think in your book, like the hockey selection could happen at like once they start going to double letters, triple letters, so that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I see. So, and I mean, in track and field, like I think that I think we have like sort of these U15 sort of matches. I know some of the provinces select for and stuff, but that's about as early as we go. I mean, I'll put you on the spot, but like, do you think that there's benefit in sort of pushing up the age of, kind of provincial identification? Because like example, so I'm in Quebec, like they have like the sort of espoir select, it's not espoir, like sometimes espoir is U23, but it's espoir like 14, 13-year-old. And they're like, naming them on provincial lists and giving them money and stuff. And I mean, I don't know, is that like it? Do you think that if we didn't do that, could there be potential benefits in our individual sport?
Yeah, and so that you're like, what the behind the scenes stuff is, the psychological gymnastics that's occurring in the athlete by giving them that feedback. Like if we give you that feedback that you're on the provincial team, we're providing pretty powerful motivator of future behavior. And so on the one hand, we don't want to remove that opportunity for development and that performance benchmark that might be really important for us. With athletics, I think we may have a perfect scenario for some of the strategies that are being used in other sports. So my colleague in Australia has developed this an algorithm for adjusting performance times based on relative age. If you have enough performance time, you can actually control for the difference across the calendar year that these days and months of age different make.
Sure.
And so they've done that in swimming, all the distances in swimming, they've come up with an algorithm to be able to correct that. And so athletes don't get raw times, they get corrected times based on relative age and chronological age.
Sure. Well, and that just makes me think, like, we also, and we on our one of our fall webinars, we had Steve Magnus on, and I know he's a fan, like when he talks about, we get stuck as like, you are your PB, right? So when you get selected to in track and field, it's your best performance gets you on the team. But if we went by a more like kind of batting average type situation where it's like, what's your, average over, a certain number of performances, that might also be a way of, again, even if maybe it's more accurate, maybe it's not, but just sending the message to the athlete that like, it's not all about like one time thing. It's about how you're doing, being consistent, which might be a more beneficial message long-term.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the subtle nuance that we're maybe not capturing in the Australian swimming data is even if you correct my time, if I'm finishing at the back of the pack, that doesn't feel very good. And so it could be because I'm a year younger than the rest of the people I'm competing against, but it's hard for my brain to actually interpret that information, even if you give me a corrected time.
Yeah.
So it's similar to the WAVA rankings that we see in masters sports. So it would be interesting to do that kind of study to see, even though your WAVA time might actually predict that you're finishing faster than some of these people, if you're at the back of the pack, how does that feel and what does that do to your motivation and interest?
Yeah, I mean, very anecdotally, I feel like masters love it. I think it's motivating for masters athletes. I think they have to be very proud of like, yeah, but my age corrected is like this, like, so there's something to it.
Well, which is interesting because they're on the, in terms of peak performance, they're on the down slope instead of on the up slope, right? So it would be interesting to look at the differences between those two phases of long-term athlete development.
Yeah. I had another thought and it's escaped me. I don't know if it's important, it'll come back, I guess. I was gonna say, sort of like context is everything. So in a couple of our provinces, I know BC for sure, the high school cross country championship is, or maybe it's changed now, but it was like a 5K race and it's just everybody. But this, so in grade 9 that you're racing against grade 12s, you're not expecting to win, and you run the same race every year, and each year you will finish higher and higher, and I think that can have a very positive effect on a kid, in terms of, instead of in Ontario, I grew up in OFSA or whatever, so like your first year, like you're in grade 9, like you win, and then maybe next year you don't win, and then you're like, what's going on? I'm not improving. But really, like, objectively speaking, you're getting better, you're improving. So there's so much, context in terms of how we frame performance and the performance results that I feel like we just don't, we just kind of go with whatever's going on. We don't really investigate.
Well, which comes back to the discussion that we had a few minutes ago about what are the developmental needs of that athlete, and then create the competitive structure and the training and development structure around them to meet those needs. And so, if the needs are better met by having a mass start race, so that they're always comparing themselves to someone in the next level, which is where we want them to be future focused. Then maybe that's a better strategy than putting them into age groups and having them go out all at once or go out in a single group.
Okay, so switch gears a bit, stay in athletics, but in athletics we integrate para. So we integrate para athletics. There's different situations where we have able-bodied and para athletes training and competing together. Wheelchair maybe not so much, but definitely in para, the development pathway is like, if we're talking about complicated, it's more complicated by a lot of different factors like entry point and obviously the impairment and stuff like that. So how do you recommend sports organizations and coaches approach para athlete development?
I think para athletics is a little bit different than a lot of other para sports, where they struggle for just getting capacity in the system to even have regional teams or local teams, because if the people aren't there, they can't train, they can't compete. With athletics, I think the advantage is that you can, depending on your classification and the access to training facilities, it doesn't matter if there's more people in your classification group, you can still get your training in. Mm-hmm. So most of the time we say, don't impose the training strategies that we would have in a non-para sport on a para population. But mm-hmm. athletics, I think, is one where you could actually do that, because the sports and the power of a training group and the lack of clear distinction between the athletes who are non-para and para, they are a big group that trains together, and there is a less distance between those groups. I think athletics is maybe one of the sports that does it the best in terms of integrating both of those groups, while recognizing that when we talk about athlete development and athlete selection in a para context, classification is such a powerful variable for determining long-term potential and viability at the high performance level,
and probably motivation too, right? Like if you're trying to figure out this classification thing and you're like, okay, this is not sports, this is a big like medical administrative thing that I'm in now, then it can be frustrating. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right. So we had a few questions from the audience, sort of people signed up and they had questions already. So we're going to start with this one. So, and in your book, it focuses a lot on sort of local, national level, but at the international level, like we do see different regions of the world having, periods of domination in various sports. Like we think Jamaican sprinters, Finnish javelin throwers, East African distance runners, Norwegian skiers. So are these instances of natural talent, or is there something else that's happening?
I think like in our research lab, we're careful not to sort of say it's one or the other, because,
I'm just setting you up, but yeah.
Well, yeah, natural talent needs the right environment in order to thrive. And I think the question of natural talent, especially the East versus West African dominance that we see in a lot of track events, for me, I think that's still a very wide open question. And it's interesting that we rarely see these kinds of hotspots emerging in countries that don't already have a cultural value of that sport. Like we're not seeing ice hockey players coming out of Australia or cricket players coming out of Canada. Mm-hmm. And so there's, obviously a pretty complicated web of nature and nurture interacting there. And it's hard to tease that apart. From our perspective, I think it's important to be careful of the messaging that we send when we see that kind of dominance. Because the message, to a young athlete who might not fit one of those groups, and you say, well, sorry, it's not going to work out for you. Well, we're undermining the potential of it ever working out for that individual. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, okay, another question that came in, and I think we kind of touched on this, but I'll ask the question, maybe we can go over it again. So you write how being selected or not can have, a different effect on different athletes. How can coaches, administrators, and parents help athletes, or maybe even help themselves, not feel entitled when they're selected? So the question was focused on this, the idea of the entitled athlete.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because we want them to take some positive feedback from that selection. And so the power of that as an indicator of competence, we want them to take that, because that feeds forward into motivation. It feeds forward into interest and doubling down in terms of training effort. We want that to happen. Mm-hmm. But we also don't want them to feel like they've reached a critical part in their journey and the striving stops. And that's something that a lot of sports struggle with, especially when athletes make junior national teams. They think, well, I'm on the pathway, I don't need to try anymore. The system has given me that golden ticket. A lot of sports struggle with that issue. I don't know of any sport that has really got it sorted out, to be honest, but there is again this psychological gymnastics that's occurring there, where we want them to take that positive feedback. We just don't want them to take it as an indicator of, maybe we come back to the issue of talent. We don't want them to use it as an indicator of talent. It's an indicator of you opening a door that's going to require you to train harder and smarter and to make more sacrifices. And if we got more coaches to frame it that way, here's what this means. It does not mean you're talented. It means that you've opened a gate that most people don't get to go through. And now this is what we're expecting.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. So in talking about coaches, how do we prepare coaches? Like, have you thought about, and this is sort of my area, have you thought about creating a kind of a coaching course around this idea to sort of expose coaches to these issues and give them some some tools to sort of be able to speak to athletes on these things? What do you think we can do for coaches, basically, is the question.
Well, I think, like, for us, it starts with recognizing that coaches are not trained in measurement. They're trained in training design and optimizing practice environments and those kinds of things. They're not measurement specialists. And so with some of the professional teams that we work with, I do every year I deliver a session for the Canadian Sport Institute, Calgary. And it's around upskilling coaches on measurement technique and why it's important and what reliability and validity of measurement is, and the cognitive bias that we might have, system bias and measurement.
So you're talking about like measurement, like as in like a stats course,
not
talent, not measuring talent, but actually just being able to understand what it means to measure something, which could be talent.
Yeah, and it's that's maybe one of the next books that I'm going to write. My research team here is getting coaches, and because it doesn't have to be a hardcore stats class. This is basic sort of understanding of what probability is and measurement and reliability and validity, like those kinds of concepts. Why you don't change your testing parameters every year as new technology comes out, because that undermines reliability of your measurement and the ability to compare what you're doing this year to what happened 5 years ago. So those kinds of simple things that I think scientists and statisticians, that's just their bread and butter. But if you're not trained in that to know those kinds of things, then you're, on the one hand, you're kind of compromising the quality of the data that you might be collecting as a coach every year.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, I think that there is a bit of a, not just between, say, statisticians and coaches, but just sort of the sports science, and coaches. Like I find myself, like, I try to read as much as I can and stuff, but then I just sometimes kind of shake my head at some of the sports science stuff that comes out, because it's like, yeah, and like that doesn't it doesn't align with what I'm seeing on the ground, or things become rigid. Like we were talking about this before with models, and you get models coming out of the science that is like, okay, like, I mean, again, just to bring up Magnus, because he talked about this a lot, the VO2 max, and like, okay, VO2 max is like a predictor of this, but like if you go actually look at the studies and you look at the error bars in the studies of the individual athletes, some of them got worse with VO2 max training. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it either, but it's just sort of like, you got to be able to investigate and kind of understand like what's the general trend. And then are you in your program, are you coaching the general trend? Are you coaching the group, or are you coaching individuals, which is harder, admittedly, right? So it's a challenge for coaches, I think, in that area.
Yeah, and it's becoming more of a challenge, I think, in this sort of age of data analytics and this sort of assumption that analytics is going to solve all our problems for us. Well, okay, maybe some problems can get solved, but if we don't ask the right questions, then the whole garbage in, garbage out sort of problem with analytics. If we don't collect good data, then we're going to end up with flawed models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think coaches too the challenge with that is you collect the data and then it sits there. Like, I mean, I admit I've taken a lot of video in my time and then taken a lot of video, right? I'm working with an athlete now, a athlete, wheelchair racer, and because I'm injured right now, so I can't get to the track. So he's got his roller, and so we Zoom, and I record the Zoom, and actually so there's a lot of video now, but I think we're making use of it actually because we've sort of been forced into this situation. But there's a lot of scenarios I can think of where like you have this data and then it's like, oh yeah. So.
And I think that was the reasoning behind this kind of a book. It would be in the place of a scientist who could analyze your data for you. If you have data, then here's how you might approach it and try to solve some questions. Because I think we don't, and coaches in sports, they can't wait for scientists or, practical scientists working with them, or research scientists like me. You can't wait for us to generate the answers for you. As a coach, you kind of need to know those things as quickly as possible. So can we provide them with the tools to figure that out?
Yeah. Or you just don't have access to those
yeah, that's the other problem.
So we got a question from the audience, and if you have questions, keep them coming. From Coach Godfrey, parents tend to have a distorted view of their kids' talent. Any advice on managing parent expectations?
Yeah, that is a can of worms being opened right now. But it's amazing how that is. When we talk to coaches, it doesn't matter what sport it is. Parents are the biggest issue that they have in terms of being a good coach these days. And so I think that was one of the things that I tried to tackle in the book was it's for coaches, but it's also for parents to try to get their perspective in terms of what talent is and how complicated it is. What we've tried to do with parents is to clarify the roles as a support of the athlete development. Clearly define what a parent's role is. Your parent's role is not to critique what the coaches do. The coach has the broad vision. The coach has the education. The coach has the training and technical skill. And so clarify to the parents, your job is to be a cheerleader for your athlete, to support them when they get home. Don't critique their performance. That's going to happen with the coach. Yeah. And so oftentimes we find when those roles aren't clearly delineated, then parents will fill that vacuum. They think, more critical feedback is always better. It isn't. As a parent, you don't want to undermine that relationship you have with your child and the desire that they're going to get from you loving them in their sport. Let the coach be the one that gives them that negative technical feedback if it needs to come.
So I have a follow-up question then. So should you coach your own kid?
That's a $1 million question right there, because we see that so often, especially in sports where coaches are volunteers, and if the parent doesn't step up, the sport doesn't happen.
It has to be someone's parent, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think for us, there would be a lot of other issues that we would want to control for. So, there's a tendency to either overinflate your child's talent or to underinflate based on what your perspective is as a coach. Mm-hmm. Like you may treat your child better, or you actually may treat them worse. And so I think there are tricks and tools that you could put in place to try to ensure that isn't happening. Maybe have a good assistant coach that keeps you on task. Normally it's when the single coach has a lot of influence and power in the decision making. You just need to add another person and have that person sort of be your sounding board. Yeah,
I can say it's hard. I had to coach my son a little bit, and I'm not a goalie coach at all, but he's 8, so it's okay. But I mean, I think we did it the right way. Like, it was just because there was a lack of people, and they said, "Can you do it?" And I asked him, "Do you mind if I do this?" And he's like, "Sure, it'll be fun." I'm like, "All right, sure." And it was okay, but we ended up with a good arrangement this year where there's another parent whose son is on the team, and he didn't want to coach the players, so he's coaching the goalies, and then I could just basically the parents' role is make sure they get there and they're dressed, say good job, say thanks coach, and feed them. That's what I'd like to be doing with my kid, basically.
Yeah, and I think it comes back maybe to one of the earlier points around if we had clear understanding of what the goals are for that training experience for that child at that age in that sport. Mm-hmm. An 8-year-old hockey goaltender, you got to think that what we want is for you to like being between the posts and not being afraid of pucks being shot at you, and maybe we'll develop some technical skill. But if we get those first two things right, you're probably going to come back and practice again next year. Yeah. If we could figure those out for athletics, passion, desire, interest. Yeah. Okay. Well, what are those things? We know those are givens, but what are the technical, what are the competitive oriented skills that we need to start to develop in those early ages?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I've always said we always, value performance, and for coaches, like we value coaches by the performance of their athletes. But I've never seen, a coach praised for, wow, you coached these kids who made it to the next level. Like they stayed in the sport.
Yeah.
Like good development coach is the one who has like the most kids going from, 14 to 18. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what they're doing. If they're still there, they're going to get better,
Yeah.
presumably. So sort of connected question from Coach Travis in terms of, maybe they'll call it like a coaching conflict or something. Would you use a similar kind of parameter for coaching spouses in a training group? Like if you're a coach and you're a retired athlete and you're dating someone, and then you're the coach now and they're the athlete, what's your take on that?
I think that's a little different scenario because when you're an adult, it's a different scenario, a different situation, because the brain is fully developed at that point. Like the difference between the adult and the child is that the child isn't capable of integrating feedback the way that adults will. You can't rationalize and say, I'm doing this for your own good, and have that kind of rational explanation with them, because the frontal lobe isn't developed enough. We don't see that until early 20s. With a spouse, I think the benefit of that is the relationship, the stability of the relationship is established. And so, you might be able to get away with some clearer, more direct feedback because the spouse doesn't have to worry about you going anywhere. There's that relationship is solid. And so, like for me,
as long as the relationship is solid, I guess.
That's the thing. Yeah. It's
I mean, I think it could also have, as with coaching your kid, like if you're the coach and your kid's on the team, and you said there's a tendency to kind of over support them or under, and it could still make it weird in the training group if it's like your husband or wife that's you're coaching them and they're part of the group. It's maybe not recommended, but as you say, adults are adults, and so
probably relates more to is the, in terms of technical skill, is the spouse still the best choice to coach that athlete to get them to continue to improve or for their performance to remain at that highest level? If the answer is yes, then I don't see that there should be too many concerns. It's more, is this the right person to put into that system for continued improvement?
Yeah, well, it's a sort of a side coaching issue, I think. But I think we, as with our systems and stuff, we fall into sort of commonplace. Like, we don't tend to think of other options a lot. We just think, well, this is the coach here, and so I'm not going to go to a different play. I mean, sometimes people do obviously want to change coaches, but I think it's not. Yeah, you would think it's the obvious ones. Like, well, we live together, it's perfect, but it doesn't necessarily. Yeah. Not necessarily the case. Okay, another question, and this is a pretty broad one, but I think it's a good one maybe we're getting near the end, so it's a good way to sum things up. What is the definition of talent that we should use? And when we communicate this, like when people start talking about talent, like how should we talk about talent?
This is again, this seems like a really simple question. What we found, and we've done a bit of work with distance running coaches with this question, is that there's a very big range of responses when we ask coaches to describe what talent is. And from a measurement standpoint, I think that's a problem for us as scientists. But from a coaching standpoint, if we can't really define what it is that we're looking for, then how do we assess whether we're accurate or not? How do we assess effectiveness of our system? What we've done in our research is propose a model of talent that looks at it as innate qualities. It has to be sort of biological, or else it's tough to distinguish it from performance or skill. It has to start with biology, but it's based in an idea that biology evolves over time based on the environments that it finds itself in. And so talent is innate, but it's also emergent over time. And so, we have to ensure that we're giving it the right time frame for it to emerge and for it to be demonstrated. It also changes over time based on dynamic interactions with the environment. It also, another quality of it is something we call symbiotic, which is the environment actually determines whether you have talent or not. And I think, sprinting is a great example. Until Usain Bolt came, we wanted sprinters that were shorter with higher leg turnover. After Usain Bolt, we were looking for, taller people with longer stride length. Mm-hmm. Well, that just showed us that the thing that we called talent changed based on how the sport evolved over time. And so for me, I think that's the creativity that we could maybe give coaches a bit more license to demonstrate is, how do you predict with this athlete that might not fit the traditional mold? How do you predict that they could change their sport if they were able to succeed and stay in it for the long term?
Right. And that's the thing with this, the sort of the selection, to go back to that, is that if you select someone on the basis of talent as defined by their performance at a particular moment, then you may not capture others whose talent, if they're put in a situation, their talent would emerge kind of even further. And I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I want you to talk about this anyway. So I think that's what you sort of called the Matthew effect. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the chapter in the book on the Matthew effects is based on all of these limitations or constraints that we have in our system that affect a person's ability to continue to develop. So the relative age effect, selecting athletes from certain geographic areas and training centers, those sorts of things that, once you're selected for the system, when you're in the system, you get greater opportunities to develop because of better coaching, more opportunities for training, better training peers to compete against. All of those things end up making the difference in the long run. And so anytime we have a system that's biased in terms of who gets those opportunities, we're creating a situation that those people who get those opportunities are going to be more likely to succeed. That doesn't mean that you're choosing the talent appropriately. It just means that your system is limiting who gets to succeed and who doesn't.
So we try to have maybe a bigger net if we can.
Well, with a realistic focus too, that we just can't keep everybody involved in the system that wants to be there at different time points. And so for us, I think our recommendation is to try to give more autonomy and ownership and agency to the athlete to make that decision. Like, this is, where you didn't make the team this year. In order to be considered next year and to come back to the training group, I need to see improvement in these areas. And this is what it's going to require. You need to do more training. You need to make more sacrifices. And if you're willing to do that, then I'll have a look at you next year and give the agency to the athlete if they want to make those sacrifices and decisions. When you do that, then we have more people that are leaving the sport under their own volition. They're maybe thinking about their sport in a more positive way. They're not thinking about it and hating track because I got cut when I was 11. Well, no, you decided to leave at 11, and maybe you come back as a master athlete in 20 years, but you leave with a more positive experience.
Yeah, I'm kind of going through that now with some people on my team that are, well, one person that's just kind of, it's, and it's, so the idea of talent, like, I feel like as a coach, any coach will tell you, they know it when they see it. Yeah. And I think you do, like, you see people and you're like, but it's like, no one is ever the full package. So it's kind of like, if you did this thing, adding to the thing that you have, then, then we're talking. And so I see this, but it's like, the athlete has had multiple opportunities to do the other thing and is not doing them. And I was speaking to my athletic director on this, and he said, when he was coaching rugby, he said, you know what? I always cut, someone every year just to, as a kind of like a social thing, to be like, to the other people who made it, like, this is worth something. This is valuable. And you have to kind of earn it in a way. And so, and I'm sure, and he's a great guy, so I'm sure he did it in a good way. And that those people who get cut will then, like, hopefully want that more, and will come back to it. And then, then your group has, maybe more depth or whatever.
Yeah, it's amazing. Every coach that we talk to has these stories of unrealized talent that they saw in their pathway, and they thought this is the next great, athlete, and they didn't work out. And we've played around with this idea in our research group of whether you can have too much talent too early. Like, if you haven't learned how to get pushed and to develop these sort of coping skills when things get difficult. If things are too easy for you, and it reminds me of this video I saw a couple of years ago of this, I think this basketball player in Montreal he's in grade 8 and he's 6'5", and none of the other players are even close to him. And so he just dunks on everybody. Well, that person's in the wrong training environment for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
6'5" is not tall enough to be, it's tall enough, but it's not special.
No, it's tall, like it's super tall when you're 13, but
yeah.
like, if that height trajectory continues, then but you probably are missing a really important window to develop technical skill that he's not having to develop because he doesn't need it. Well, he's eventually going to need it. And if he hasn't learned how to acquire that and get pushed around early on, are we compromising his long-term potential by not putting him in the right environments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, on that, and this, I think, sort of a follow-up question to maybe something else, but it applies here. Like, what are the psychological effects of bumping someone up in age group? So you take a 13-year-old and you're like, look, we're going to put you with 17-year-olds because they're the same size as you.
Yeah.
Can that be good or bad?
I think it's, and we're like, a lot of sports are having this discussion, and I think this would fall under psychological safety, right? Like I think there's nothing wrong with that as long as you've prepared the athlete for the difficulties of being a 13-year-old playing against 17-year-olds. They have different needs. They have different, they're at different stages of development. They're going to say different things to that person than people his own age would. As long as you can prepare them and be ready to catch them if there's a fall, then I don't know what the problem is, because we've seen enough examples of kids that have done that, or kids that come from families where a couple of their brothers are a little bit older. We see this in the birth order effect, that kids that come from families where their older siblings were almost national team members are more likely to make it to national team themselves.
Yeah.
So there is power in that environment. We just have to figure out exactly what it is and how to deliver it better.
Yeah, definitely looking at my younger son to be the hockey star. No. That's not the goal.
Doesn't happen all the time.
No. So that's great. I mean, we're coming up on the end. I don't see any more questions coming up from the audience. One last thing, and you mentioned one project, so maybe a different one. What's next for you in your research, or what your next book might be?
We have a ton of research happening at the moment. The one that I'm most excited about that ties into something that I talk about in the book is being able to quantify how many people we actually need in the system to produce that one person who emerges at the end, because we have a tendency to focus on that person with a medal around their neck. And it started with a discussion that we had with the Texas Rangers guys when we were down there once, that we don't actually want to get too good at talent identification, because if we could look at somebody at 11 and say, you know what, you're not going to make it, and you are, we actually need that person to keep the person who's not going to end up an Olympian. We need that person in the system to push the one who eventually becomes an Olympian, because in the absence of that, those people don't develop in a vacuum. Right. They push themselves against hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other athletes. So if we could do that, I think we'd have a better understanding of how we could treat people at different levels of the system and how valuable they are to the creation of that one super athlete at the end.
That's really interesting. I mean, it seems a bit off brand to try to reduce it to a number, but I guess it's probably going to be more complicated than that. Yeah,
for sure. It's these economics models that we see in healthcare. Like, it's just so we can kind of tie in the grassroots and the recreation sport with high performance. A lot of people talk about them as if they're two separate things, but they're not. They're part of the same ecosystem, and we have to get all of those things right in order to have a really efficient system.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's great. So thanks so much for your time. This has been awesome. I love the book.
Thanks,
and I'm trying to make everybody read it, and I don't know, try to have get people sitting around a table and try to maybe make changes. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, wouldn't that be something?
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot. And so everyone, hopefully see you in February 23rd for Mysteries and Myths of the 800. And this will be up on YouTube probably in a couple of days. So thanks. Thank Dr. Baker, and thanks everybody.
Thanks.